Welcome back to Youth Sports Positive, where we bring the have fun, work hard mentality into youth sports. I'm Kelsey Dennehy alongside my dad, Mark. We hope everybody had a happy Thanksgiving with lots of great food and people. Today, we have a very special guest, our very first on YSP. He is the Vice President of the Minnesota Wild Foundation and Community Relations, the Director of College Hockey Inc., Executive Director of Minnesota Hockey, the 2019 Oscar Almquist Award winner, the 2013 Minnesota Hockey President's Award winner. He's Youth Sports Positive. Welcome to the podcast, Mike Snee.
Hi, Kelsey. Hi, Mark. Thanks for having me today.
Really appreciate you doing this.
Probably had conversations like this 60 or 70 times, so this is the first time I guess we've recorded it, huh?
Yeah, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, Mike. No, you're sort of my comfort. When I'm struggling with something that's going on in youth sports, you're one of the people that I pick up the phone and hopefully I've been there for you. But really, you are the first guest for a reason. I've got a lot of respect for your experience, which Kelsey just went through, and also your passion for it. And you've done such great work in Minnesota and throughout youth hockey, throughout amateur hockey for that matter. So
likewise, Mark, and you've challenged my thinking a lot, so I appreciate all that you've done.
Yeah, we're really looking forward to this one. And I guess just to get things started, Mike, if you want to give the listeners a little bit of a background on what you do on a day-to-day basis, what your job looks like.
Sure. I'm with the Minnesota Wild. It's a new position that I started last summer. So I've been here over a year now. And it was a role that was somewhat created to address exactly what we're going to talk about today, which is community hockey here in Minnesota and ensuring that hockey in Minnesota remains as affordable as possible, as accessible as possible, and as culturally as meaningful as it currently is, and ensure, I guess, that we don't lose that. And then in the process, let's make it better because it's certainly not perfect here. And then just celebrate the heck out of it. So the Minnesota Wild, I give them a lot of credit. I worked for them for a decade, right when they got started. And from day one, they've really embraced all levels of hockey in Minnesota, from participating in it to following it to caring about it. And they continue to do that to this day. And I'm fortunate that there's a role that they created to kind of acknowledge that when they started, I think you could take it for granted because the business of youth sports and certainly the business of youth hockey hadn't picked up the steam back in the late 90s that it has now. And so to recognize that there might need to be more thoughtfulness to just ensuring what we have here, that we don't lose it. So I'm excited that I get to have this role, and I'm really fortunate.
That's great. And I think from what I've read, a big part of your role is the Minnesota model. So for our viewers, if you don't mind just giving us some context into what that actually is.
Yeah, and I think the answer is actually really easy. It's exactly like football everywhere in the country. So whether you're in Massachusetts, South Dakota, California, Maryland, Texas, Missouri, wherever, young people play football when they're 13 or 14 for their community football association. And then when they're 16 or 17, they play for their high school. They do all of that in generally on a not-for-profit field. It might be owned by a school, might be owned by a park and rec department, might be owned by a county or a city. But the point of the football field is to serve the community and not necessarily act as a business. And there are teams everywhere. In other words, large metro areas don't put their best football players on two teams and then travel the globe to play football games. They do it locally, whether you're in a rural community, in a wealthy suburb, in the inner city, whatever it might be. And it's that way, coast to coast, border to border. That's how we play our football. There's 15,000 varsity football teams in the country. Every Friday in September and October, there's 7,500 wonderful high school football games going on. Again, doesn't matter where you are, it's happening in our country. That's how we do hockey in Minnesota. I think we tend to overthink it, where I think the answer is really simple. My one sentence answer is we play hockey, and the Minnesota model is the football model. hockey in Minnesota has a lot more in common with football elsewhere in the country than it does with hockey elsewhere in the country.
Real quick, Mike, and it's the first time I've heard you explain that, and it makes it pretty clear. Like football, do you guys also is high school hockey locked into certain days? So, like you said, in the United States, Friday night in the fall is high school football. Saturday's college football, Sunday's pro football. Does hockey have a similar type of guideline?
Yeah, I would say it's generally Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday are game days. Like football, high school hockey is a 6-day-a-week experience. Sundays are there's nothing on Sundays. Generally, games are Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I would say with an emphasis on Thursday and Saturday. And the soul, I would say, of high school hockey is outside of the Twin Cities metro area. When you get to the small towns, especially in northern Minnesota, but really now full credit to the entire state. A lot of hockey growth in newer areas in the southern and western parts of the state. But really, when you go to that rink in Grand Rapids or Thief River Falls or Crookston or War Road or Roseau, any of those small towns, the vibe and feel on a Saturday in January is very similar to the vibe and feel at the football field on a Friday in September. You got a band, you have alumni, you have the whole community there. You have little kids aspiring to be the high school players in 10 years when they're 16 and 17, wearing the same jerseys same jerseys and same colors as their high school heroes. So it's not terribly, I think, difficult to understand when you put it in that context, because everybody, at least in the United States, everybody understands how football works, and nobody suggests that. I've never heard anybody suggest that the best football player in the country is not going to excel at college because they only played 9 high school games last year. Or you never hear anybody suggest that that guy that was really good at football as a high school junior needs to find something different his senior year because he already dominated his junior year. So that's the context here in Minnesota. And it starts generally in early November, late October, depending on if you're playing girls or boys, and then runs into March. But just like having to kind of keep up and evolve, a hockey player in Minnesota can play and usually does play before and after the high school season. Where they play might vary. It could be a junior league. It could be tier 1 AAA hockey here in the state, which we do have before and after. It doesn't travel the country necessarily. It sticks to Minnesota, so it maintains that local feel. But a high school hockey player, if they want to, will play 60 to 70 games a year, but they don't have to if they want to play football or soccer or be involved in a different sport. They absolutely still have that opportunity to do it. So you have, I would say, more choice here when you're playing high school hockey or even high-level youth hockey because of the length of the season. But if you want to be all in, 13 months a year, inside edge coach, outside edge coach, all of that, you have the opportunity to do that if you want to do it, but it's not required.
I can confidently say that I did not have an inside and outside edge coach growing up. But
it did, Kelsey. It was probably Mr. Riley, who was a good friend of mine, who he and I committed to coaching each other's children because we wanted to be more like dad than a coach. But can you talk a little bit about some of the positives of this community-based piece, Mike, if you can? Because there are a lot, and the cost of sport is one of them. And you guys have done a great job in Minnesota of keeping that down.
Yeah, I've over time here, since I got interested in this topic, and I first got interested in 2008 when I started my role with Minnesota Hockey. I think there's really 5 categories that you can measure youth hockey or youth sports. And I think I say this all interchangeable. Other than football, which is still very similar to what it was like 30, 40 years ago. It's still very affordable, very local, very culturally meaningful. All other competitive youth sports have really ventured into the for-profit, privatized business world, which I know you've talked about already in your first 2 podcasts. And hockey is not escaped that. So the five categories that you can measure youth hockey or youth sports in my opinion, are just quantity of players, how many kids are playing the game, how many kids reach higher levels, college and professional. What is the financial cost for the parents to have their kids play that sport at a competitive level? What are the other costs? So the ones that don't necessarily cost money, but mean the culture of the sport is to send your kid away from home early, or the culture of the sport is to travel every Thursday so you miss school on Friday, or the culture of the sport dictates that you have your kid go to school online because of the amount of travel that occurs. And then the fifth one, which I think is extremely important but is hard to measure, is how is the youth delivery of the sport making an impact on the culture? Is it meaningful? Is it inspirational? We talked earlier about high school football, which gets an A+ in that category because high school football is so impactful on the health of the sport of football and inspiring the next generation of kids to want to play football. So I look at those five categories, and I can confidently say that, at least compared to the rest of the United States, Minnesota far excels, if that's even a way to say it. It excels by a large margin in all five of those categories. The one category where it excels actually a little less is the overall number of players that play the sport. Minnesota does lead the country in overall number of players that play the game, but as you go up the ladder, as you move up the competitive ladder and move into high school hockey and then college hockey and then professional hockey, Minnesota actually gets better. It over indexes. It has a greater market share. So I'm not suggesting by any means that hockey in Minnesota is perfect. It's not, but it thrives because it's local. It thrives because it's community. It thrives because the players are spread out. I frequently hear in hockey the notion of like steel sharpens steel, and that we have to put all our best players on one team. But what I like to say here in Minnesota is our best 12-year-olds, our best 14-year-olds, our best 16-year-olds and 18-year-olds. We don't really have a pyramid. We have probably 130 top Pee-wee or 12U teams across the state. And then when you get to high school, we have the same number. So we have 130 kids that see themselves as the best player on their team. We have 130 kids that see themselves as the top goalie. We have 130 opportunities to be a captain. And then because we have 130 teams, the kids don't need to leave to play hockey. And then that just feeds itself because the sport is more affordable and more local. Then more kids, more families are willing to get their kid into it. And it just kind of feeds on itself. So I can identify, I believe, areas to improve. But when compared to elsewhere, honestly, I wouldn't change anything in Minnesota to become like the rest of the country. I think that there are things we can implement from Europe, especially from Scandinavia, better job in that area. But like I said, Minnesota plays their hockey like the rest of the country plays their football, and there's a lot to like about the popularity of football right now in our country.
Did you guys ever have challenges, especially with parents raising concern or trying to push back in terms of my kid needs to be the star, this, that, the other?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the primary reason why I believe why my role was created and why we're putting even extra effort into this, because even in spite of all of those measurements being so positive for what we call community hockey in Minnesota, community hockey, I should have defined that right away. That's our nonprofit youth associations, vibrant high school hockey, and then very important, it's the municipally invested in, publicly owned, not-for-profit ice arenas that are found throughout the state. So those three things make up community hockey. And even though community hockey's measurements by those five categories that I just mentioned are far and away beyond the rest of the country, the for-profit world of hockey, which exists in, for the most part, the rest of the country. I know it's in some places it's entirely kind of a for-profit. Elsewhere, it might be more of a hybrid moving towards the for-profit. We have what I would call a segment of our hockey parents are very active. You could use a different word if you want, but they're very active. They're very open to a sales pitch. They're very, very open to the idea that the more you spend, the better it is. They're very open to the idea that the more you travel, the better your player is. All of which I can emphatically say is not true. But the way that you make money at youth sports is obviously charging more and then, giving more than just a local experience. So what is happening is, in spite of all of these great indicators about our hockey hockey outcomes, our hockey output, you're seeing more and more families choose not to do it. Not a huge number, but a noteworthy number, certainly more than there were last year or 5 years ago. And before this becomes a problem, I guess I would say before the toothpaste is out of the tube, we want to address this. So part of what we've created here at the Wild is to educate, inform, celebrate, provide the data, provide the research to allow parents the comfort level and like, hey, wait a minute, my kid is in the best possible environment in our country to reach his or her full potential. And part of that is embracing the stuff that the two of you have been talking about in the previous episodes. One of you said that if you take 2 8-year-olds and one 8-year-old plays hockey 12 months out of the year and the other 8-year-old plays hockey 5.5 months, at some point the one that does it 12 months out of the year will look better than the other one. But the player who's playing multiple sports and not playing hockey year round will not only eventually catch up, will frequently surpass and have much less likely occurrence of burnout or so on. So that is part of the process here, is ensuring that families realize that playing community hockey is just like playing community football. And for the most part, 97% of the players that you watched play football on Thanksgiving played their football just like a kid in Minnesota plays their hockey. And because the for-profit privatized aspect has not really entered football, at least it hasn't entered the core part of football. You might have a trainer, you might have a quarterbacks coach, you might have something like that. But high-end aspirational football players their parents don't get phone calls from entities trying to make money off of them nearly as much as a high-end aspirational hockey player does. So, Kelsey, to answer your question, absolutely there are families here who are pushing back on the idea that they can't just they just can't create a team of all the best players in the Twin Cities and then travel and by the way, recruit 1 or 2 from northern Minnesota and have them live in their basement and then travel the country and increase the cost of that hockey, decrease the accessibility of hockey, and significantly reduce the cultural meaningfulness of the sport.
One of the reasons I wanted to have you on is, and the name of the podcast is Youth Sports Positive. It is to make other parts of the country aware of the special things you guys are doing, and that it's not just kumbaya, everyone gets a trophy, right? To me, and you've heard me say this, I believe that if you're running a youth hockey organization, your job is to create an environment where the kids can fall in love with the sport. If you get enough kids involved, you're going to have some elite athletes come through your program. But what you're also going to do is you're going to end up with a large number of adults that love the sport. And so for anyone, and we have a lot of listeners from Massachusetts, that's where we're based. And for anyone from Massachusetts that hasn't had the opportunity to go to see the hockey state tournament, it's humbling, to be honest with you. And one of the things that frustrates me is that we in Massachusetts had that. It was very community based. And you go back to when I was in middle school, and Mike, you and I have talked about this, Massachusetts and Minnesota were kind of neck and neck. Is that fair to say? In terms of high level talent production?
For sure. And there were moments, it was probably a 50-50, counter-punch type of thing, but there were moments where Massachusetts was ahead of Minnesota, for sure.
All you have to do is watch Miracle, right? And see that, that was real. A lot of the Boston colleges, we're made up of mostly Massachusetts, New England players, and most of the Minnesota colleges. Now, there's something to be said for those colleges going out now and recruiting the world. That's great. I think that's wonderful. But you know, you shared with me some numbers that to me are eye-opening, and I want to make our listeners aware of it. I think we have almost 2 million more people in our state, maybe 1.5 million more than you do. I think right now you have 10,000 more overall participants in youth hockey, both male and female. But your numbers continue to climb, and ours are shrinking. From 2009 to 2025, you've gone from 12,849 U8 boys to 12,924. Pretty close to being the same, plus 75, I think. In Massachusetts, we've gone from 11,172 to 9,252. We have lost 2,000 boys entering our program. And it has its effect at the top, too. And these are numbers, thankfully, I was able to get. In 2003, there were 204 young men from Minnesota that played Division I hockey. Now there's 247. That's plus 43 for those of you at home doing the math. In 2003, Massachusetts had 185 Division I male hockey players, and there's now 117. That is a reduction of almost 40%. And so we spend more than we ever have in Massachusetts. We travel further than we ever have in Massachusetts, and pay more, and we're developing fewer. It's just become cost prohibitive. Why haven't other parts of the country adopted what you're doing, Mike?
And Mark, I want to add on to that what you just said there is all true. You can't even argue with it. I mean, they're numbers, right? They're facts, they're data. Yet Minnesota is becoming more like Massachusetts. Massachusetts is not becoming more like Minnesota. In other words, by the day, it's getting more expensive. By the day, it's getting more commercial and less community. And that's true here in Minnesota. You would think the counter would be the case, but in fact, it's the exact opposite. And I would say the root of it, Mark, is it's hard to make money off of the community delivery model of a sport. And that is what is driving sports, with maybe the exception of football, competitive level of sports in our country. We have given the keys to the business world. And I also hesitate to say too much about Massachusetts or anywhere else in the country. I've never lived anywhere in the US other than in Minnesota. I've certainly read a lot about it, talked with people about it. So I have some thoughts, but I don't know what it's like elsewhere. And I would acknowledge that I don't think elsewhere, other states are going to start to invest the public money into the sport, both via facilities and high school hockey programs, that we do here in Minnesota. So the fact that we have that is why we always lead with, we want to preserve, strengthen, and celebrate community hockey. We don't want to lose this. We don't want to lose the culture where we look at ice arenas the same way that we look at bike paths and playgrounds and football fields. They're all community assets. And I understand elsewhere in the country either has not much of that or none of that. All right. And especially in newer places in the country, I get it that unless somebody decides to invest their own money in an ice facility, there will not be hockey available. Okay? That's elsewhere. In Massachusetts, I don't know. I don't know all of the reasons why it used to be a lot like Minnesota and now it's not much like Minnesota. I don't know if the leaders of hockey, which probably now in Massachusetts are the people that make the most money at it. They're the leaders. They're the rule writers. They're the ones that dictate what the sport's going to look like. Can they get in a room and challenge themselves and say, we have got to address some of this to make the sport more affordable and have more kids doing it and have it mean more? Again, I hesitate saying that because I don't live there, so it's really not for me to say. But I'd challenge someone and say, that at least at a macro level, we have not made this sport better in our state. We've made it worse. And why is that? And then just at least say it out loud. And maybe somebody will just say, yeah, I know it's worse, but I make a lot of money at it this way. And I wouldn't make a lot of money if it was that way. I think some aspect of it is just to get people to say it out loud. But my observation on elsewhere, and the reality to me is I don't think Massachusetts is going to become Minnesota again, just because there are people that do well at the sport financially under the context of how it's delivered now. And elsewhere in the country that's had very little kind of hockey history, I don't suddenly think that they're going to start to look at ice facilities the way they look at bike paths and football fields. So we have to make it better under that context. And I appreciate rink owners. I appreciate people willing to invest their money and take a risk so that kids can play hockey. But I do think the lesson that they can take from Minnesota is don't put all of your best 14-year-olds on one team and then have nobody else in your area that they can play. So then they have to be road warriors every other weekend. You can have local hockey in a for-profit model. And I look at places like a Dallas or a St. Louis, a place that has enough facilities. They have enough kids that play hockey. I wish they would look at themselves kind of like, not like the Twin Cities, but look at themselves like little versions of Duluth or Moorhead, where they don't have a lot of population. They probably have just as many kids playing hockey in a St. Louis or a Dallas or a Phoenix or a Southern California that they have in northeastern Minnesota. Yet instead of having one super team, they'll have 8 teams. And then those 8 teams play each other all the time. So you keep the sport so much more local and affordable. And then it just strikes me that, and if I want people renting my ice as much as possible because I own the rink, well, then have them stay in your community 100% of the time. Don't send them to other communities to rent other rink owners' ice. And I hear people say, well, we just don't have enough players to do that. And I think that's a pretty flawed statement 4 out of 5 times, because in those areas, you do actually have enough people to have, instead of 1 or 2 teams, have 6 or 7 or 8 teams, and then just understand that that's better for the whole. And I get it. That's a very simple statement for me to say. And as Kelsey pointed out, all it takes are a handful of parents that say, no way am I having my kid play with that kid or play against that kid. And then you've got the issue that you have right now. But if there's a lesson that I think the rest of the country could draw from, it's look at the number of teams that we have. And I'll use the word, we water it down. And I say that in a positive way. We spread out the talent. I say that in a positive way. And that's why the sport is so accessible and so affordable. Now, certain families here choose to get on teams that travel the country. They choose that, but you don't have to do that. And there are so many examples of kids reaching a very high level of hockey without doing either any of that or very little of that.
Well, and that makes it kind of goes to the point of, and it seems like this is the theme of the whole conversation, is cost is prohibiting people from playing hockey. And so just how much does it cost in the community-based model to play ice hockey in Minnesota in comparison to, I guess, at Massachusetts or somewhere else where people are just dumping cash into stuff that's not really going to benefit them?
Yeah. I've heard through social media or conversations what it costs elsewhere. But again, I hesitate to comment because I've never had to pay those fees. But we have talked a lot here with the most intense hockey families, and we have them. We have tons of them. The most expensive year of hockey here is probably a player's 13, 14, 15-year-old year. When they get to high school hockey is heavily subsidized, just like all high school sports. So the costs go down when you get to high school. But when you're that player that's like a higher performing 15U girl or bantam boy, and if you choose to play 12 months out of the year, but what I would say, you choose what I would call an appropriate long-term athlete development way of playing, where you have your core season, which is the winter season, which will usually be late September to mid-March. And then you supplement that with off-season training, intense hockey training, probably doing that partly at your association, but also partly at a privatized training facility, which we have a lot of here in the Twin Cities. I would bet the most aspirational 12 months out of the year hockey player could have that experience here in Minnesota for $8,000. Now, you could also choose to say, no, I'm going to be intense about hockey in the winter, and then in the off season, it's weightlifting, other sports, and then my association's off-season training programs. And you could do it for $4,000 to $5,000. And then if you're outside of the metro area, it's even less, because the hockey is even more part of the community, and there's even more public investment in the access to hockey. Now, as I said, there are some families that they want to be on the brick team. They want to be on the play in 7 tournaments, not in Minnesota in the summer. You have every right to do that. And then that cost is going to be greater, but you certainly don't need to do that either to play the game. There's no requirement. There's nobody that's saying like, hey, if you want to play hockey in the winter, you have to do all of my off season stuff. You don't have to do that. And then the research shows that increasing your likelihood of where you land as a 19 or 20-year-old is not relative. So it's not, it's a sport that has barriers that are simply required to play it. It's not running based. It requires a unique playing surface. It's not on a field or in a gymnasium. It requires equipment, and that equipment is expensive, whether you're in Minnesota or Boston. So there are already barriers on this sport that other sports like soccer and basketball and baseball just don't have. So we should be more aware of unnecessary barriers, not less aware. And it feels like, to some degree, in much of the country, it's like, well, it's already a certain amount of money just to begin with. So hell with it. Let's just go crazy.
That I think is such a true statement that I think people don't necessarily realize is what's happening, or don't want to acknowledge that that's what's happening. What is your message to parents who maybe are feeling societal pressures because of what's going on around them, because of all of the people saying that they can turn their kid into a star, they can make them better for X amount of dollars? What's your message to them to remind them what youth sports are really about?
I hesitate for that message to be from a hockey standpoint outside of Minnesota. Minnesota is where we have the statistics and the research. That's where I work. That's where my employer is based. So it really here is to just understand how good we have it here. And whatever your reason for having your kid play hockey, whether it's because you want your kid to play in the NHL or PWHL, or you just want your kid to have hockey be part of their wintertime experience and to be part of something that's so culturally meaningful to our state and so attached to the identity of our state, that your kid should play hockey. It's part of living in Minnesota. And if your kid plays, whether they end up being lightly skilled their entire life, or they're off to be the next Jake Gensel or Jake Ottinger or Taylor Heisey, that what we have in place works better than anywhere else in the country. There is room for improvement, but that improvement is done here in Minnesota. I feel like sometimes this comes off as a negative, but it really is a positive. It's, if we lose what we have here, we will not get it back. And we know, based on elsewhere, that all of those measurements that I brought up a little while back, will decline in all categories. There will be fewer kids that play hockey. Those that do will pay a lot more money. Those that do will have other negative impacts on their life in terms of being pulled out of school, being pulled out of their home, whatever it might be. And the sport will just mean less. It'll mean less to the community. I would argue that the state high school hockey tournaments here are the second biggest annual event in Minnesota behind the state fair. And I don't want to lose that. We don't want to lose the state fair, and we don't want to lose the state high school hockey tournaments. They're that meaningful to our state. So I guess I would say to our parents is just believe in what we have, and that you're either part of the long-term solution and improvement, or you're part of us losing this. And the conversations that I tend to have are more macro. Not micro. I don't want to tell any one parent what their values should be or so on. And I know I've heard the two of you talk about, why you get kids into sports and stuff. And I don't want to tell somebody who's their goal is for their 8-year-old to play in the NHL. I understand how unrealistic that is. And that, it's not why I would have my 8-year-old playing a sport, but it's not for me to tell that parent that that's not the right reason for you to have your 8-year-old playing the sport. But if that is the reason that you're having your 8-year-old play the sport, Minnesota has by far more NHL players than any other state, and the vast majority of them played community association hockey and high school hockey.
Yeah, and kudos to the Wild for what they're doing. The last question I have in regards to the community-based stuff is, what's the future look like, Mike? Like you're working on a day-to-day basis in the present to preserve this. Where do you see it going?
That's a great question. On one hand, I feel optimistic. I'm an optimistic person in general, and you're seeing. I think more understanding. I think more people are aware. I certainly think more parents want it to be the way it is here and don't want it to become more expensive, more travel focused. Yet a fair number of parents will do what they feel they have to do. But I think that there just is more awareness. So things like Mason West winning the Prep Bowl with his Edina High School team, and being a number one NHL draft pick, and realizing that all of that happens not only as a kid that plays association community hockey and then high school hockey, but also while playing another sport at a very high level. That maybe this old school way of playing your hockey actually should be the new school way of playing your hockey. So I feel good in that regard. But every other day I'm reading something about more private equity coming into youth sports. I see about another community building a 16 diamond baseball and softball complex, all with the desire of attracting young baseball and softball players from around the country. And
Yep.
So it just youth sports and youth hockey is getting more and more lucrative by the day to the people that are trying to, make as much money as they can off of the sport. And I say that acknowledging that in some communities in our country, there wouldn't be hockey if it weren't for the rink owners. So I applaud those people and acknowledge their role in just the growing of our sport in this country. But I fear, I feel like this isn't a very good answer. I'm saying, on one hand, I'm optimistic that the future of hockey and the future of hockey in Minnesota is going to look better tomorrow than it does today. But at the same time, I'm a realist. My head's not buried in the sand, and there is a lot of money to be made if you simply cater to the parents that are so far into their kids' hockey that they'll literally spend $30,000 to $40,000 on it. There's money being left on the table in Minnesota. There are families spending $8,000 on their kids' hockey that would spend $38,000 if they felt it was better for their kid.
Well, keep fighting the fight. Hopefully, anyone that listens to this podcast that maybe didn't know what the Minnesota model looks like in the community versus commercial recognizes the great things you're doing there. So well done, and keep battling.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear your perspective. And you mentioned Mason West. We like to share positive plays of the week on our show to bring back the positive part of youth sports and highlight things that we see across the country and what they're doing. And Mason West has been a topic of conversation pretty much on every episode that we've done. So it's fitting that he is playing in Minnesota. that he's from Minnesota, and that he has won the high school state championship for his football team. It kind of connects all of the dots together. You talk about the Minnesota model being the football model, being what football is in the United States. And Mason West is kind of a prime example of what an athlete can look like as a multi-sport athlete who is just all of the things that make up a professional athlete in terms of genetic composition, drive, commitment, loyalty, this, that, and the other. How awesome has it been to see this storyline play out and watch him be so successful in a sport other than hockey?
Well, it's spectacular. Uniquely, his birthday, I believe, is either July or August. So he's an older kid for his grade. And that made him NHL draft eligible last year. And so the story is really because he was in his draft year last summer, not this summer, which most high school players are. Mark, I think the draft cutoff is September 15th. Is that right?
It is. Yep.
Yeah. So it's not as unique as someone might think. I guess the fact he's a first round draft pick, but most players are drafted after high school, not before their senior year of high school. And I think that's what added a layer to this. But he's not the only player on the Edina football team that's also a very serious hockey player. In fact, Chase Borgard scored 6 touchdowns in the championship game, and he is Edina's goalie. And last year as a junior, he had a 93% save percentage and a 1.8 goals against average. And today, well, I know this is being recorded, but he won the Prep Bowl on a Friday, and on Monday he's at hockey practice.
That's
and
awesome.
So I will say, as much as one, I'm going to be a little bit negative. As great as the Mason West story is, why is he not playing high school hockey this year? We love the fact that he's playing high school football. But our hockey model says, yeah, but if you're a serious hockey player, you can't play that watered down high school hockey. You dominated last year, so you need to move on. Well, Justin Jefferson went to a public high school in Louisiana. He dominated as a junior, and he went back as a senior, just like all high school football players. So my challenge is just to challenge people that we look at hockey compared to hockey, and we don't step back and look and say, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So Chase Borgard is going to be between the pipes for the Edina Hornets hockey team this year after winning a state championship and scoring 6 touchdowns in the state championship game.
That's awesome. Great story.
I didn't know that Mason West wasn't playing high school hockey. That's really interesting.
He did last year. Yeah, he did. He did up until this year, but he is leaving and for the USHL. And I'm a fan of the USHL. It's not an anti-USHL thing. It's just culturally, he is being told by the media, by the outside world, that if you're serious about hockey, then you have to leave. But he's not culturally being told, if you're serious about football, you got to leave. Like I often think, Minnesota, the Twin Cities, we have 140 high school hockey teams in Minnesota. We probably have 240 high school football teams. Look at other large populated metro areas. I'm kind of fascinated by St. Louis. St. Louis probably has 125 high school football teams, and they have 2 tier 1 teams. It's going down a path I didn't think I'd go down here. I would just say we need to take more lessons from the sport of football and how we deliver hockey and other sports for that matter, but certainly how we deliver hockey to our kids.
Well, it's funny to think about because working in Sioux Falls, I cover high school football very closely in the fall time. And as you're saying this, I'm racking my brain thinking about all of the different football players who are committed to play Division I football next year and are playing for their high schools.
Playing for their high school. And they're not all playing for the same 2 high schools, right?
No. There's open enrollment in Sioux Falls, which means you can just pick up and leave and go to a different school if you feel like that's the case. And it happened at a high school that got a new football team. A bunch of the major talent went there and enrolled in that school. And it was great for a good chunk of time. And then since then, it's kind of leveled out with the rest of the conference. But it's interesting to think about how many kids are playing just high school football. They're not doing anything else. They're going and playing basketball in the winter, and they're playing baseball in the spring, and then they'll go play Division I college football in the summer and fall.
The Edina goalie is proof that you can do that as well in hockey.
Yeah, and there's certainly kids that transfer around here in hockey. Would it be wonderful if 100% of kids and their parents just said, "This is my town, this is my team, I'm not leaving it"? But it happens. It's happened forever. It probably happens more now, but it was going on when I was a kid. So that certainly happens. But I know one of the most popular Vikings of recent memory is a guy named Chad Greenway. And he played 9-man high school football in South Dakota, and then went to Iowa, and then had a long NFL career with the Minnesota Vikings. And my guess is that at no point was Chad getting calls from advisors or Tier 1 club teams or junior teams or academies or even the National Football Governing Body telling him that he had to leave his tiny little town in South Dakota. But if he were a hockey player today, his parents, it would be relentless, the number of people that would be calling his parents saying, "You're doing your son a disservice by keeping him in your town and having him play that watered down, not even real 9-man football." And Chad Greenway is not an exception. You just talked about it, Kelsey. There are kids from all over South Dakota that reach their full potential at football at rural communities, at wealthy suburbs, at lower income inner city areas, and everything. And that's the lesson that we need to take, is that stay local, stay home, and keep the sport as affordable, as accessible, and as culturally meaningful as possible.
Well, and that's the message of the day. That's what we're trying to incorporate into hockey today, specifically, but also just any sports. Hockey's a little different because, like you mentioned earlier, there is that extra barrier of needing ice to play and equipment. But in the grand scheme of things, we're wanting that to be the case for all sports. So, Mike, we like to send our viewers off with a playbook, with something that they can go and read or listen to in the coming week and a half in between our podcast episodes. Is there anything you can recommend to our listeners for this week's playbook?
I will recommend not a particular podcast, but a podcast subject. And there's a lot out there. A lot of it is what's the person who wrote Range, and
Dave Epstein.
He has a really good one, but he's not the only one. There's a lot of comparison of the upbringing of Roger Federer and Tiger Woods. I think you could easily state a case that they're the best ever in their sports. I mean, there's probably an argument to be made, but at minimum, they're two of the best ever in their sports, if not the best ever in their sports. And based on what I've heard and read, and I've listened a lot about this topic, they could not have had more polar opposite upbringings, especially in terms of how they played the sport that they ended up becoming best in. Tennis for Federer, obviously, and golf for Tiger Woods. And I think that's a fascinating subject. And it's too bad, in my opinion, that culturally we hear a lot more about Tiger Woods' upbringing than we do Roger Federer's upbringing. And I believe that's because Tiger Woods' upbringing can be packaged and sold by people that want you to buy the sport from them. They want you to be a customer 12 months out of the year. They want you to specialize early. They want you to make it 8 days a week and 13 months out of the year. I can make money at that. It is really hard to make money at the way Roger Federer grew up, where he did not focus on tennis until well into his teenage years. And he didn't do anything for more than a few months at a time during his childhood. If all I have to sell is hockey, I can't make a lot of money if you're only having your 10-year-old play hockey 4 months out of the year. So the Roger Federer story is undertold and the Tiger Woods story is overtold for that reason, in my opinion. So anything that you can find out there, and there's a lot that compares Federer and Tiger Woods, I think is a really good listen.
You beat me to the punch, Mike, because there are two David Epstein books that I like, but today I was going to recommend Range, so I'm glad you brought it up. It's a pretty easy read, and it just talks about how, just as Roger Federer did, you don't have to specialize in one sport, and that by decentralizing it and playing other sports, it can actually enhance whatever sport you choose in the end. I'm a firm believer, and I've talked to strength and conditioning coaches that because kids specialize so early, they've had to change how they train them to almost train them to be more athletic. So those are great examples. I would recommend Range by David Epstein for anybody who's interested in that topic.
Mike, where can people find resources through the Minnesota Wild and through the work that you're doing?
They can. I think right now the best thing, contact me. Is so feel free to share my contact info. But if they come to our website and go to the Skated Forward tab at wild.com, that's the best. Skated Forward. I don't even know if we've talked about that, but that's the name that we've given to this initiative, to this movement. There's a lot everywhere in youth sports and hockey, but certainly in Minnesota, there's a lot of people volunteering their time or doing things for very minimal compensation to make sure that, as I like to say, the hockey campsite is left better than when they found it, and that hockey in our state's better tomorrow. And so that's they're skating it forward. They're paying it forward. If you go to the Wild website, which is wild.com, there's a Skated Forward tab, and go up there, and then that's how they'll get to what we're doing, what we're working on, and in particular, information about what we're trying to do to preserve, strengthen, and celebrate community hockey in Minnesota.
Well, Mike, that's really great. We thank you so much for joining us today and sharing all that great insight into the hard work that you guys are doing with the Wild. We really, really appreciate it.
I'll tell you what, this is the quietest I've been on the podcast out of the three. I only hope that our future guests can do as great a job as you have. I could listen to you talk about this subject forever. So really, thanks a ton.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. I always enjoy the opportunity to visit with you, Mark, and nice to visit with you, Kelsey.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Well, make sure to visit all of those links that Mike just said to you guys, and be sure to let us know what your positive play of the week is down below. As always, like, comment, subscribe, follow us on social media at the Youth Sport Positive. That's where we post links, and our website, youthsportpositive.com, is where we post all of those great resources that we talk about in our episodes. Well, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Youth Sports Positive. For Mike Snee, my dad, Mark Dennehy, and myself, make sure to bring the work hard, have fun mentality back to youth sports in your life, and we'll see you in 2.